When Sarah Whitehorse was barred from her own father's funeral by the very town he'd helped build, she thought the humiliation was complete. But when a lone Comanche warrior rode straight into the ceremony and spoke words that shattered 20 years of carefully guarded lies, the people of Cedar Ridge learned that some truths refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep you dig the grave.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The morning sun hung like a copper coin over the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, Texas, casting long shadows between the weathered buildings that made up what the locals generously called civilization. It was September 15th, 1887. And the town had dressed itself in its finest mourning clothes for the funeral of Colonel Marcus Whitehorse, the man whose name graced the biggest ranch in 3 counties and whose influence had shaped every major decision in Cedar Ridge for the past 2 decades. But Sarah Whitehorse wouldn't be attending her father's funeral. She stood at the edge of Boot Hill Cemetery, hidden behind a cluster of mesquite trees, watching as the entire town gathered around. The polished mahogany casket that held the only family she'd ever known. From her concealed position, she could see the procession winding its way up the hillside. Mayor Caldwell in his best black suit, the town's most prominent families dressed in their Sunday finest, and leading them all, Margaret Whitehorse, the colonel's widow, draped in expensive black silk that had probably cost more than most folks in Cedar Ridge made in a year. Sarah's own dress was simple brown cotton, faded from too many washings and mended in places where the fabric had given way to hard use. Her boots were scuffed leather that had seen more honest work than the polished shoes clicking against the cemetery's stone paths. She'd braided her long black hair simply, without ornament, because she owned nothing fine enough for such an occasion. But then again, she reflected bitterly, she wasn't supposed to be at this occasion at all. The trouble had started 3 days ago, when Sarah rode into town to make arrangements for her father's burial. She'd heard about his death the way she heard about most things concerning the Whitehorse family, through whispered conversations in the general store, passed along by the few people in Cedar Ridge who still spoke to her with anything resembling kindness. Colonel Whitehorse had suffered a heart attack while inspecting cattle on the far range of his sprawling ranch. He'd died alone, as he'd lived most of his life, with only the endless Texas sky as witness that Sarah had hitched her horse outside Jameson's funeral parlor and walked through the front door with the quiet dignity she'd learned to maintain in a town that had never quite known what to make of her. Inside, she found Henry Jameson, the undertaker, discussing arrangements with Margaret Whitehorse and her son, William, Sarah's half-brother who'd inherited his mother's pale complexion and his father's capacity for cruelty. The moment Sarah entered the room, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Margaret's face, already pinched with grief, hardened into something approaching hatred. William, who at 25 had never worked a day in his life, but commanded respect simply by virtue of his name, actually took a step backward as if Sarah carried some contagious disease. "What are you doing here?" Margaret's voice cut through the funeral parlor's hushed atmosphere like a blade through silk. Sarah removed her hat, a gesture of respect that went unacknowledged. "I came to pay my respects to my father and to help with the arrangements." "Your father?" William's laugh was harsh, bitter. "Sarah, you may share his blood, but you were never his family. Not really." Sarah felt the familiar sting of those words, the same one she'd been hearing in various forms since she was old enough to understand what they meant. But she'd learned long ago not to show pain to people who took pleasure in causing it. "Colonel Whitehorse was my father," she said quietly. "I have as much right to mourn him as anyone." Margaret stood up, her silk dress rustling like autumn leaves. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, with the kind of refined beauty that came from never having to worry about where your next meal was coming from or whether you'd have a roof over your head when winter arrived. Her blonde hair was perfectly arranged despite her grief, and her jewelry probably cost more than most people in Cedar Ridge would see in a lifetime. "You have no rights here," Margaret said, her voice cold enough to freeze whiskey. "Marcus may have acknowledged you in certain ways, but you were never part of this family. You're a reminder of his biggest mistake, and I won't have that mistake dishonoring his memory at his funeral." Henry Jameson shifted uncomfortably behind his desk, clearly wishing he could disappear into the wallpaper. Sarah had known Henry since she was a child. He'd been one of the few people in town who'd never treated her differently because of the circumstances of her birth. But even Henry's kindness had limits when it came to opposing the Whitehorse family's wishes. "Now, Mrs. Whitehorse," Henry began diplomatically, "perhaps we could find some accommodation." "No accommodations," William interrupted. "She's not welcome at the funeral, she's not welcome at the burial, and she's certainly not welcome at the reading of the will afterward. The family has spoken." Sarah looked from William to Margaret, seeing in their faces the same cold rejection she'd encountered her entire life. These people had never accepted her as family, had never acknowledged her right to exist in their world, but she'd foolishly hoped that death might soften their hearts enough to allow her to say goodbye to the man who, despite his flaws, had been the only father she'd ever known. "I see," Sarah said, replacing her hat with careful deliberation. "Then I suppose there's nothing more to discuss." She turned to leave, but Margaret's voice stopped her at the door. "Sarah." The older woman's tone carried a warning that made Sarah's skin crawl. "I hope you understand that any attempt to disrupt tomorrow's ceremony would be most unwelcome. Sheriff Patterson has been made aware of the family's wishes regarding your presence." Sarah turned back, meeting Margaret's cold stare with her own steady gaze. "I understand perfectly, Mrs. Whitehorse. I always have." As Sarah walked out of the funeral parlor, she heard William mutter to his mother, "I can't believe the old man kept sending her money all these years. Thank God that nonsense dies with him." Those words followed Sarah all the way back to her small cabin on the outskirts of town, echoing in her mind as she tried to make sense of a grief that had nowhere to go. The Colonel had indeed sent her money, not regularly, not generously, but enough to keep her from starving during the lean years. More importantly, he'd visited her occasionally, always in secret, always after dark, bringing books and news from the wider world beyond Cedar Ridge. During those visits, usually no more than 2 or 3 times a year, Colonel Whitehorse had been a different man from the stern, commanding figure the town knew. He'd sit at Sarah's small kitchen table, drinking coffee that was stronger than anything served in the fancy hotels in San Antonio, and he'd tell her stories about the ranch, about the changing times, about his hopes and fears for the future. He'd never said he loved her. Colonel Marcus Whitehorse wasn't a man given to expressions of sentiment, but he'd shown her kindness in the only way he knew how. And now he was dead, and his legitimate family was determined to erase any evidence that Sarah had ever mattered to him at all. Sarah's cabin sat on 5 acres of scrubland that the Colonel had deeded to her when she turned 18, though he'd done it through a lawyer in San Antonio to avoid causing gossip in Cedar Ridge. It wasn't much, a 2-room structure with a stone fireplace, a small barn, and a well that sometimes ran dry during the worst of the summer heat. But it was hers, and it represented the only security she'd ever known. She'd made a living over the years through a combination of seamstress work, taking in laundry, and occasionally serving as a midwife for the Mexican families who lived on the edges of town and couldn't afford the doctor's fees. It wasn't a prosperous life, but it was an honest one, and Sarah had learned to find satisfaction in work well done and debts honestly paid. But tonight, sitting in her cabin with only the crackling fire for company, Sarah felt the weight of 28 years of isolation pressing down on her like a physical thing. Tomorrow, the town would gather to mourn Colonel Marcus Whitehorse, to celebrate his life and his contributions to Cedar Ridge's growth and prosperity. They'd speak of his leadership, his vision, his devotion to his family. And Sarah, who'd inherited.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
His stubborn streak and his sense of justice, along with his dark hair and strong jawline, would be expected to stay away, to pretend that her father's death meant nothing to her, to accept once again that her existence was an embarrassment to be hidden. She'd built a fire against the September night's chill and was mending a torn shirt by lamplight when she heard the sound of a horse approaching her cabin. Sarah set down her needle and thread, listening carefully. It was late, well past the time when decent folks were expected to be in their beds, and Sarah had learned long ago to be cautious about unexpected visitors. Living alone as she did, with no family to protect her and few friends to call upon, she developed an instinct for trouble that had served her well over the years. The hoofbeats stopped outside her door, followed by a gentle knocking that suggested the visitor wasn't there to cause harm. Sarah picked up the shotgun she kept loaded beside the fireplace and approached the door carefully. "Who's there?" "Miss Sarah, it's Tom Brennan from the livery stable. I've got something for you." Sarah knew Tom. He was one of the few people in town who'd always treated her with courtesy, perhaps because his own Irish heritage had made him familiar with prejudice and exclusion. She opened the door to find him standing hat in hand, looking uncomfortable and slightly out of breath. "Tom, what brings you out here so late?" Tom glanced around nervously, as if he expected someone to be watching from the darkness. "Miss Sarah, I probably shouldn't be here, but I thought you ought to know. Your father, the colonel, he left something for you. Something Mrs. Whitehorse doesn't know about." Sarah's heart began to beat faster. "What kind of something?" Tom reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, and bearing her name in her father's familiar handwriting. "He gave this to me 3 years ago, right after he took sick that first time. Made me promise to give it to you if anything happened to him, but to wait until after the funeral arrangements were made." Sarah took the envelope with trembling hands. It felt substantial, as if it contained more than just a letter. "Did he say anything else?" Tom nodded, his weathered face serious in the lamplight. "He said to tell you that he was proud of the woman you'd become, and that he was sorry he couldn't do right by you while he was alive. He hoped maybe he could do right by you in death." Sarah's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for 3 days. "Thank you, Tom. This means more than you could know." Tom touched his hat brim and turned to go, then paused. "Miss Sarah, I know the family said you weren't welcome at the funeral tomorrow, but if you was to find yourself somewhere on Boot Hill during the ceremony, well, I don't reckon there's any law against a person walking in a public cemetery." After Tom rode away, Sarah sat at her kitchen table staring at the envelope for a long time before opening it. When she finally broke the wax seal, she found 2 items inside: a letter written in her father's careful script, and a small object wrapped in soft leather. The letter was longer than any communication she'd ever received from him, written in the formal style he used for business correspondence, but infused with an emotion that made her chest tight with grief. "My dear Sarah, if you are reading this, then I have passed from this world, and I can only hope that I am finally at peace with the choices I made during my time on Earth. I write this knowing that my legitimate family will not welcome you at my funeral, and knowing that I lack the courage, even in death, to force them to acknowledge what everyone in Cedar Ridge has always known but never spoken aloud. You are my daughter, Sarah, as much as William is my son, and perhaps more so in the ways that truly matter. You have your mother's beauty and her gentle heart, but you have inherited my stubborn streak and my sense of justice. I have watched you grow from a distance, and I have seen you become a woman of character and strength despite the hardships you have faced because of my cowardice. I was never able to give you the life you deserved, to claim you publicly as my child, to provide you with the education and opportunities that should have been your birthright. I told myself that I was protecting you from scandal, but the truth is that I was protecting myself from the consequences of my choices. I loved your mother, Sarah, loved her in a way that I never loved Margaret, but I was too weak to break the chains of social expectation that bound me to a marriage of convenience and financial advantage. When your mother died giving birth to you, I felt as though I had lost the best part of myself. I should have taken you in then, should have raised you as my daughter regardless of what people might say. Instead, I allowed fear and social convention to make me a stranger to my own child. This is the greatest regret of my life. I hope the enclosed gift will provide you with some measure of the security and independence that every child deserves from their father. More than that, I hope you will remember that you carry within you the blood of chiefs and warriors, that you are descended from people who never accepted defeat, never surrendered their dignity, never allowed others to define their worth. Be proud of who you are, Sarah. Be proud of what you have accomplished on your own. And if my death brings you sorrow, let it also bring you freedom from any need to prove yourself worthy of a man who was never worthy of you. Your loving father, Colonel Marcus Whitehorse. Sarah's hands shook as she unwrapped the leather bundle, revealing a silver pendant in the shape of a horse's head, intricately carved and set with a small turquoise stone. It was beautiful, clearly valuable, but more than that, it was a tangible connection to the father who had loved her from a distance, but had never found the courage to love her openly. As she fastened the pendant around her neck, Sarah made a decision that would have consequences far beyond anything she could imagine. She would go to her father's funeral, not to cause trouble, not to disrupt the ceremony, but to say goodbye to the man who had given her life, and then spent 28 years trying to figure out how to love her without admitting she existed. She would stand among the mesquite trees on Boot Hill and watch as they lowered Colonel Marcus Whitehorse into the ground. She would mourn him quietly, with dignity, and then she would return to her cabin and try to build a life from the ashes of dreams that had never had a chance to flourish. But Sarah Whitehorse had inherited more than her father's stubborn streak and sense of justice. She had also inherited his ability to underestimate the power of secrets to shape the future. And she had no idea that tomorrow's funeral would set in motion events that would change not only her own life, but the very fabric of Cedar Ridge itself. As she prepared for bed, the silver pendant warm against her skin and her father's letter carefully folded in her dresser drawer, Sarah couldn't know that 20 miles away, a Comanche warrior named Joseph Stone Bear was making his own preparations for tomorrow's ceremony. Nor could she know that her father's death had awakened something in him that had been sleeping for 20 years, something that had the power to shatter the comfortable lies that Cedar Ridge had built its prosperity upon. The morning of the funeral would bring revelations that would shake the town to its foundations. But tonight, Sarah Whitehorse simply mourned her father and tried to find peace with a lifetime of rejection and isolation. Tomorrow, everything would change. 20 miles south of Cedar Ridge, in a valley where the Brazos River carved its way through limestone bluffs and cottonwood groves, Joseph Stone Bear sat motionless on his paint horse, watching the sun climb toward its zenith. The morning air carried the scent of sage and distant rain, but Joseph's mind was focused on something far removed from the natural world around him. In his weathered hands, he held a telegram that had arrived 3 days ago, its simple message containing the power to resurrect ghosts he'd thought buried forever. Colonel Marcus Whitehorse dead. Funeral September 15th. Thought you should know. T. Brennan. Joseph had read those words 100 times since receiving them, each reading bringing a fresh wave of memories he'd spent 2 decades trying to forget. Tom Brennan, the Irish livery stable owner who'd befriended Joseph during his rare visits to Cedar Ridge, was one of the few white men who knew the truth about Joseph's connection to the Whitehorse family. It was a truth that could destroy reputations, topple the carefully constructed social order of an entire town, and finally give voice to secrets that had festered in darkness for far too long. At 45, Joseph Stone Bear carried himself with the dignity of a man who'd walked between two worlds his entire life and found himself fully accepted by neither. His father had been a Comanche war chief, a leader whose name was still spoken with respect around council fires throughout the territory. His mother had been a Mexican woman captured during a raid, who'd eventually chosen to remain with the tribe and raise her son in the traditional ways. Joseph had inherited his father's commanding presence and his mother's gift for languages, making him a natural intermediary between the Comanche people and the expanding white settlements that now dotted the Texas landscape. But it was a third inheritance that had shaped Joseph's life in ways his parents could never have foreseen. During a buffalo hunt in 1867, when Joseph was barely 25, he'd been thrown from his horse and trampled by a wounded bull. The injury should have killed him, but he'd been found by a young cavalry patrol led by a captain named Marcus Whitehorse, who'd ordered his men to transport the injured Comanche to the nearest army post for medical treatment. It was an act of mercy that violated army protocol and risked Whitehorse's career, but the young captain had been moved by something in Joseph's eyes, an intelligence and dignity that transcended racial boundaries. During Joseph's long recovery at Fort Richardson, the two men had developed an unlikely friendship built on mutual respect and a shared understanding of honor. Whitehorse was fascinated by Joseph's knowledge of the land and its peoples, while Joseph found himself drawn to the captain's genuine desire to find peaceful solutions to the conflicts tearing Texas apart. Their friendship had deepened over the years, surviving Whitehorse's promotion to colonel and his eventual retirement to civilian life. Joseph had served as an unofficial scout and negotiator for the army, helping to prevent dozens of potential conflicts between settlers and native tribes. In return, Whitehorse had used his influence to protect Joseph from the anti-Indian sentiment that periodically swept through Texas, ensuring that his friend could move freely between the white and native worlds without fear of persecution. But their friendship had been tested in ways that neither man could have anticipated when a young Comanche woman named Maria Moonhawk had entered their lives in the summer of 1858. Maria had been everything that traditional Comanche society valued in a woman: beautiful, intelligent, skilled in the domestic arts that kept a family fed and clothed, and possessed of a spiritual connection to the natural world that made her a respected figure among the women of her band. She was also Joseph's intended bride, promised to him through arrangements made by their respective families when they were still children. Joseph had loved Maria with the intensity of a man who'd found his perfect complement, and their upcoming marriage had been celebrated throughout their band as the union of two of their most promising young people. But Maria's fate had been sealed not by Comanche tradition, but by her encounter with Colonel Marcus Whitehorse during a peace negotiation in the spring of 1859. Whitehorse had come to the meeting ground accompanied by territorial officials and Indian agents seeking to establish boundaries that would prevent further conflicts between settlers and native peoples. Joseph had served as translator, and Maria had been among the women who'd prepared the traditional feast that would seal any agreement reached between the negotiating parties. Joseph had watched his friend's face when Maria entered the council circle, had seen the immediate and unmistakable reaction that transformed the dignified cavalry officer into a man struck by lightning. Maria, for her part, had been equally affected by her first sight of the tall, fair-haired soldier whose eyes held depths of kindness she'd never expected to find in one of the people her own tribe had been fighting for generations. The attraction between Marcus Whitehorse and Maria Moonhawk had been immediate, overwhelming, and completely impossible within the social structures of both their peoples. White society would never accept a cavalry officer's marriage to a Comanche woman, while Maria's own people would view any romantic involvement with a white soldier as the ultimate betrayal of everything they held sacred. But love, Joseph had learned during those painful months, recognizes no boundaries of race or culture. Despite every rational reason why they should have stayed apart, Marcus and Maria had begun meeting in secret, using Joseph as their go-between and confidant. Joseph had found himself in the impossible position of facilitating a relationship that was breaking his own heart while simultaneously threatening to destroy everything he'd worked to build between the white and native communities. The affair had continued for almost a year, with Marcus making increasingly frequent trips to the frontier under the pretense of military business, and Maria finding excuses to visit trading posts where she could meet her forbidden lover. Joseph had watched his intended bride fall deeper in love with another man, had seen his closest friend torn between duty and desire, and had slowly felt his own world crumbling around him. The crisis had come in early 1860, when Maria discovered she was carrying Marcus's child. The pregnancy could not be hidden, and the scandal would destroy not only the three people involved, but would likely spark a war between the army and every Comanche band in Texas. Something had to be done, and it had fallen to Joseph to find a solution that would save everyone he cared about. The plan he'd devised had required sacrifices from all three of them. Maria would disappear from Comanche territory, officially reported as killed during a fictional raid by hostile Apache. Marcus would arrange for her to be secretly transported to a remote cabin he'd purchased under an assumed name, where she could give birth and raise her child away from both communities that would reject them. And Joseph would help maintain the deception, visiting Maria periodically to ensure her safety and serving as the only link between her and the outside world. It had seemed like the perfect solution to an impossible problem, but Joseph had underestimated the corrosive power of secrets and the human heart's capacity for guilt and regret. Marcus had visited Maria as often as his military duties allowed, but the strain of maintaining his double life had gradually transformed him from the idealistic young officer Joseph had befriended into a harder, more cynical man. Maria had given birth to a daughter she'd named Sarah, but the isolation and shame of her situation had slowly eaten away at her natural vitality and joy. Joseph had watched both of his friends suffer, had seen their love turn into something painful and desperate, and had gradually realized that his noble gesture had solved nothing. It had simply spread the poison of their impossible situation over a longer period of time, causing more suffering for everyone involved. The end had come in the winter of 1862, when a particularly harsh blizzard had trapped Maria alone in her cabin for weeks. By the time Joseph had been able to reach her, she was dying of pneumonia, delirious with fever, and calling alternately for Marcus and for the Comanche family she'd been forced to abandon. She'd lived long enough to place her 2-year-old daughter in Joseph's arms and to make him promise that he would ensure the child was cared for. "She has his eyes," Maria had whispered with her dying breath, "but she has our blood. Never let her forget that she comes from warriors." Joseph had buried Maria in a grove of cottonwoods beside the cabin, marking her grave with a simple stone cairn that bore no name. Then he'd faced the most difficult decision of his life: what to do with Sarah, a mixed-race child who belonged fully to neither world and would be rejected by both. Marcus had been campaigning in New Mexico when Maria died, and by the time Joseph reached him with the news, the colonel was already showing signs of the emotional withdrawal that would characterize the rest of his life. The death of the woman he'd loved had broken something essential in Marcus Whitehorse, leaving behind a man capable of duty and responsibility, but seemingly incapable of the kind of deep emotional connection that had once defined him. "I can't raise her," Marcus had said, staring at his infant daughter with eyes that held more pain than Joseph had ever seen in another human being. "If anyone discovered she was mine, it would destroy her chances of any kind of normal life. But I can't abandon her either." Joseph had made his second great sacrifice then, agreeing to place Sarah with a childless Mexican couple who lived on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge. The Hernandez family had been good people, honest and hardworking. who'd raised Sarah with love and kindness until they'd both died in a cholera epidemic when she was 15. Only then had Marcus stepped forward, acknowledging Sarah as his ward while carefully avoiding any public admission of paternity. Joseph had watched from a distance as Sarah grew into a beautiful and intelligent young woman who'd inherited her mother's spirit and her father's determination. He'd seen her struggle with the isolation and prejudice that came with her ambiguous position in Cedar Ridge society, and he'd felt his own guilt grow heavier with each passing year. Sarah was paying the price for the choices made by 3 adults who'd thought they were protecting her, but who'd actually condemned her to a life of perpetual exclusion. Marcus had tried to provide for Sarah financially, but he'd never been able to give her what she really needed: acknowledgement, acceptance, and a place in the world where she truly belonged. The Colonel's marriage to Margaret Dalton had been a calculated alliance designed to advance his business interests and social standing, but it had also effectively ended any possibility that he might ever publicly claim Sarah as his daughter. Joseph had carried the weight of these secrets for 28 years, watching as the consequences of that long-ago love affair continued to shape and damage the lives of everyone involved. He'd kept his promise to Maria, checking on Sarah periodically and ensuring that she knew something of her Comanche heritage, but he'd never been able to give her the full truth about her parentage or her mother's fate. Now Marcus was dead, and, according to Tom Brennan's telegram, Sarah had been banned from her own father's funeral by the family that had never acknowledged her existence. Joseph knew that Margaret Whitehorse and her son William were capable of cruelty, but this final insult to Sarah's dignity had awakened something in him that he'd thought buried with Maria. 25 years ago, Joseph guided his horse down from the bluff and began the ride towards Cedar Ridge, his mind filled with memories of the young woman he'd helped raise from a distance. Sarah had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, but she'd also inherited something else from her mixed heritage, a strength that came from learning to survive in a world that had no place for people like her. It was time, Joseph decided, for the people of Cedar Ridge to learn some uncomfortable truths about their beloved Colonel Marcus Whitehorse. More importantly, it was time for Sarah to understand that she came from a line of warriors who'd never accepted defeat, never surrendered their dignity, and never allowed others to define their worth. The funeral was scheduled to begin at 2 o'clock, and Joseph planned to be there when it did. He'd remained silent for 28 years, honoring promises made to dead friends and keeping secrets that had protected no one. But silence, he'd finally realized, was just another form of cowardice, and he'd been a coward long enough. As he rode towards Cedar Ridge, Joseph thought about Maria's final words to him, about the promise he'd made to ensure that her daughter knew she came from warriors. He'd failed in that promise for nearly 3 decades, allowing fear and social convention to keep him from giving Sarah the truth about her heritage and her parents' love story. But today, that would change. Today, Joseph Stone Bear would finally find the courage that had eluded him for so long. He would ride into that funeral, face down the entire town if necessary, and make sure that Sarah Whitehorse received the acknowledgement and respect she'd been denied her entire life. The people of Cedar Ridge were about to learn that some secrets are too powerful to stay buried forever, and that the sins of the past have a way of demanding payment when you least expect it. Joseph had spent 28 years living with the consequences of his silence, but today, he would finally speak the words that could heal old wounds, or tear an entire community apart. As the sun reached its peak and began its descent toward the western horizon, Joseph Stone Bear rode toward his destiny, carrying with him the power to transform Sarah Whitehorse's life and challenge everything the people of Cedar Ridge thought they knew about honor, family, and the price of keeping secrets. The funeral was about to begin, but Joseph suspected that before the day was over, it would be the lies and pretensions of an entire town that would be buried in Boot Hill Cemetery. The bells of Cedar Ridge's only church began tolling at exactly 2 o'clock. their bronze voices carrying across the dusty streets and weathered buildings like a summons to judgment. Boot Hill Cemetery, perched on the highest ground overlooking the town, had been transformed into an elaborate stage for grief, with dozens of folding chairs arranged in precise rows before the freshly dug grave that would serve as Colonel Marcus Whitehorse's final resting place. Margaret Whitehorse sat in the front row, draped in black silk that had been specially ordered from San Antonio for the occasion. Her blonde hair was arranged in an elaborate style that had taken her Mexican maid 2 hours to perfect, and her jewelry caught the afternoon sunlight like captured stars. Beside her, William Whitehorse fidgeted with his gold pocket watch, impatient for the ceremony to begin so it could end, and he could get on with the business of claiming his inheritance. Behind them, the citizens of Cedar Ridge had arranged themselves according to the strict social hierarchy that governed every aspect of life in the small frontier town. Mayor Caldwell and his wife occupied the second row, followed by the town's merchants, bankers, and professional men. Further back sat the ranchers and farmers whose prosperity depended on the Whitehorse family's continued goodwill, and in the very last rows, the shopkeepers and craftsmen who served the town's elite, but would never be invited to join their ranks. Conspicuously absent from this carefully orchestrated gathering was any representation of Cedar Ridge's Mexican population, the vaqueros, and laborers whose sweat had built the Whitehorse Ranch, but whose presence at the colonel's funeral might have suggested an equality that made the town's Anglo residents uncomfortable. Also missing were the few remaining Comanche families who still lived on the fringes of white society, trading their knowledge of the land for the right to exist in the shadow of the civilization that had displaced them. Sheriff Tom Patterson stood at the edge of the gathering, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol as he scanned the crowd for any sign of trouble. At 62, Patterson was a weathered veteran of the Indian Wars who'd earned his position through courage and competence rather than political connections. He'd served under Colonel Whitehorse during the final campaigns against the Comanche, and his loyalty to his former commander was absolute and unquestioning. Patterson's pale blue eyes swept over the assembled mourners, cataloging faces and noting the few empty chairs that marked the absence of people who should have been there, but weren't. The sheriff knew about Sarah Whitehorse's existence, as did most of the longtime residents of Cedar Ridge, but knowledge and acknowledgement were very different things in a community that prized respectability above truth. The ceremony began with Reverend Jonathan Mills, a tall, cadaverous man whose fire and brimstone sermons had been terrorizing Cedar Ridge's sinners for the better part of a decade. Mills had never served in the military, had never faced death in battle, and had never been forced to make the kind of life-and-death decisions that had shaped Marcus Whitehorse's character. But he spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who'd never doubted his own righteousness, and his eulogy painted the dead colonel as a paragon of Christian virtue and frontier leadership. "We gather today to honor a man who embodied the very best of our American ideals," Mills intoned, his voice carrying across the cemetery like the tolling of a funeral bell. Colonel Marcus Whitehorse was a soldier, a rancher, a leader, and above all, a family man who understood his duties to God, country, and community. Hidden among the mesquite trees at the edge of the cemetery, Sarah Whitehorse listened to these words with a mixture of grief and bitter irony. The Reverend spoke of her father as if he'd been a saint, a man without flaws or contradictions, someone whose life had been lived entirely in the bright light of public approval. There was no mention of the secret visits to a cabin on the outskirts of town, no acknowledgement of the complicated man who'd struggled with the consequences of choices made in youth, no recognition of the love that had transcended racial boundaries and social conventions. Sarah had arrived at the cemetery an hour before the service was scheduled to begin, positioning herself where she could see the proceedings without being observed by the mourners. She wore her best dress, a simple navy blue garment that had cost her a month's wages from her seamstress work, and she'd braided her long black hair with special care. Around her neck, hidden beneath the dress's high collar, hung the silver pendant her father had left her, its weight a tangible reminder of his love and regret. From her concealed position, Sarah could see the elaborate floral arrangements that surrounded her father's coffin, expensive displays of roses and lily that had probably cost more than she earned in 6 months. Margaret Whitehorse had spared no expense in creating a funeral that would be remembered and discussed for years to come, a public demonstration of the family's wealth and social standing that served as much to enhance the widow's reputation as to honor the dead man's memory. As Reverend Mills continued his eulogy, Sarah found herself remembering a very different version of Marcus Whitehorse. She thought of the man who'd sat at her small kitchen table during his secret visits, drinking coffee that was too strong and talking about books he'd brought her from his personal library. She remembered his awkward attempts to be a father to a daughter he could never publicly acknowledge, the way he'd light up when she showed him her needlework or told him about a book she'd read. Those memories were precious to Sarah because they revealed a side of her father that no one else in Cedar Ridge had ever seen. The public Marcus Whitehorse had been all sharp edges and military bearing, a man who commanded respect through his presence and his accomplishments. But the private Marcus Whitehorse, the one who'd visited her in darkness and shadow, had been gentler, more vulnerable, haunted by regrets he could never voice in choices he could never undo. The Reverend's words were interrupted by a commotion at the edge of the cemetery as a lone rider crested the hill, his horse moving at a steady pace that suggested neither urgency nor hesitation. The man sat his mount with the unconscious grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle, and even at a distance, there was something about his bearing that commanded attention. Sheriff Patterson was the first to notice the approaching rider, his trained eye immediately cataloging details that most of the mourners missed. The horse was a paint, marked with the distinctive patterns that marked it as Indian bred. The rider wore buckskin and cotton rather than the wool and broadcloth favored by white settlers, and his long black hair was braided in a style that proclaimed his heritage to anyone familiar with native customs. "Well, I'll be damned," Patterson muttered under his breath, recognizing the rider despite the years that had passed since their last encounter. Joseph Stonebear looked older, more weathered, but there was no mistaking the dignified bearing and penetrating gaze that had made him one of the most effective scouts and negotiators on the frontier. The sheriff's hand moved instinctively to his weapon, not out of hostility but from the ingrained caution of a man who'd survived decades of frontier violence. Joseph Stonebear was no threat to the people of Cedar Ridge, but his presence at Marcus Whitehorse's funeral was unexpected and potentially explosive. Patterson knew enough about the colonel's past to understand that Joseph's arrival might herald revelations that could shatter the comfortable illusions that had governed Cedar Ridge society for decades. Margaret Whitehorse had also noticed the approaching rider, and her reaction was immediate and visceral. Her face, already pale beneath her widow's veil, turned white as bone, and her gloved hands clenched in her lap with such force that her knuckles cracked audibly. She leaned over to whisper something urgent to her son, and William's head snapped up, his eyes tracking the lone horseman with obvious alarm. The mourners began to stir and murmur as they became aware of the interruption, their carefully arranged solemnity giving way to curiosity and unease. This was not part of the scripted ceremony that Margaret had planned so meticulously, and any deviation from the expected order of events threatened to upset the delicate balance of respectability she'd worked so hard to maintain. Reverend Mills faltered in his eulogy, his voice trailing off as he noticed the distraction spreading through his audience. He followed their collective gaze to the approaching rider, and his thin face hardened with disapproval. The Reverend had strong opinions about the proper place of Indians in civilized society, and he clearly viewed this intrusion as a violation of sacred boundaries. Joseph Stonebear rode through the cemetery gates without slowing, his paint horse picking its way carefully between the headstones and monuments that marked the resting places of Cedar Ridge's deceased. He seemed oblivious to the stares and whispers that followed his progress. His attention focused entirely on the elaborate funeral tableau that had been arranged around Marcus Whitehorse's grave. Sarah watched from her hiding place among the mesquite trees, her heart racing as she recognized the man who'd been a mysterious but constant presence throughout her childhood. Joseph Stone Bear had visited her periodically over the years, always arriving without warning and always bringing news of the wider world beyond Cedar Ridge's narrow boundaries. He'd taught her about her mother's people, the Comanche, sharing stories and traditions that had helped her understand the part of her heritage that her father could never acknowledge. But Joseph's visits had always been brief and cryptic, marked by long silences and meaningful looks that suggested depths of knowledge he was reluctant to share. Sarah had always sensed that he knew more about her parentage and her place in the world than he was willing to reveal, and his presence at her father's funeral suggested that the time for secrets might finally be coming to an end. Joseph dismounted about 50 yards from the gathered mourners, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the dozens of hostile eyes focused on him. He was dressed in a mixture of traditional and contemporary clothing that reflected his position as a man who moved between two worlds, buckskin leggings and moccasins, but also a white cotton shirt and a black vest that showed respect for the solemnity of the occasion. Around his neck he wore a bone choker decorated with blue and white beads, and his long black hair was braided with strips of otter fur that marked his status as a war leader among his people. At his side hung a knife in a beaded sheath, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of his identity and heritage. Everything about his appearance proclaimed his refusal to hide or apologize for who he was, even in the heart of a community that viewed his people as conquered enemies. Sheriff Patterson stepped forward, positioning himself between Joseph and the mourners, his hand still resting on his pistol, but his posture more cautious than threatening. The two men had a history that went back 20 years, built on mutual respect and shared experiences that transcended the racial boundaries that divided their peoples. "Joseph," Patterson said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard by the nearby mourners, "this is a private funeral. Family only." Joseph Stone Bear's dark eyes swept over the assembled crowd, taking in the expensive clothes, the elaborate floral arrangements, and the carefully orchestrated display of grief and respectability. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I knew Marcus Whitehorse for 28 years, he said, his English precise and unaccented despite his heritage. "I served with him, fought beside him, and considered him a brother. If this funeral is for family only, then I have more right to be here than most." The statement hung in the air like a challenge, its implications rippling through the crowd of mourners like a stone dropped into still water. Margaret Whitehorse's face had gone from pale to ashen, and her son William was half risen from his chair, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Reverend Mills had recovered from his initial shock and was preparing to assert his authority over the proceedings. "Sir," he called out in his most commanding pulpit voice, "this is a Christian funeral conducted according to proper religious and social protocols. I must ask you to respect the wishes of the family and withdraw from these sacred proceedings." Joseph's gaze shifted to the Reverend, and there was something in his expression that made the clergyman take an involuntary step backward. When Joseph spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty and moral authority that no amount of theological training could match. "Sacred?" Joseph repeated, the word falling from his lips like a judgment. "There is nothing sacred about lies, Reverend. Nothing holy about denying truth. Nothing Christian about turning away a daughter from her father's grave." The words hit the gathering like a physical blow, sending shockwaves through the carefully maintained facade of respectability that had governed the ceremony. Gasps and coos. Murmurs erupted from the crowd as the implications of Joseph's statement began to sink in. Everyone in Cedar Ridge knew about Sarah Whitehorse's existence, but it had always been one of those open secrets that polite society agreed to ignore. Margaret Whitehorse rose from her chair, her silk dress rustling like the wings of an angry bird. Her face was a mask of outraged dignity, but there was fear in her eyes, the terror of a woman who saw 20 years of careful social positioning threatened by the words of a man she'd hoped never to see again. "How dare you?" she cried, her voice carrying across the cemetery with the force of genuine panic. "How dare you come here and disturb my husband's funeral with your lies and accusations? Sheriff Patterson, I demand that you remove this man immediately." But Sheriff Patterson made no move to comply with Margaret's demand. Instead, he stood frozen between the two forces, his weathered face reflecting the internal conflict of a man caught between duty and conscience. He knew Margaret Whitehorse's social power, understood the consequences of defying the town's most influential family. But he also knew Joseph Stonebear's reputation for honesty and honor, and he'd seen enough of the world to recognize truth when he heard it. Joseph Stonebear stepped forward, his moccasined feet silent on the cemetery grass, his presence commanding attention from every person present. He moved with the fluid grace of a natural athlete, but there was something else in his bearing, something that spoke of spiritual authority and moral certainty that transcended racial boundaries and social conventions. "I have kept silent for 28 years, Joseph said, his voice carrying easily across the cemetery without being raised. "I have honored promises made to the dead and kept secrets that served no one. But I will not stand by and watch as you deny a daughter the right to mourn her father." He turned to face the crowd directly, his dark eyes sweeping over the assembled mourners with the intensity of a man preparing to speak words that would change everything. In the distance, hidden among the mesquite trees, Sarah Whitehorse held her breath and waited for the revelations that would finally explain the mysteries that had shaped her entire life. The moment of truth had arrived, and nothing in Cedar Ridge would ever be the same again. The silence that followed. Joseph Stonebear's words stretched across Boot Hill Cemetery like a taut wire, vibrating with the tension of secrets about to be shattered and lies about to be exposed. Every face in the crowd had turned toward the Comanche warrior, some reflecting curiosity, others showing fear, and a few displaying the kind of hunger that comes from witnessing the destruction of those who consider themselves untouchable. Margaret Whitehorse stood frozen beside her husband's coffin, her black silk dress whipping in the prairie wind like the wings of a carrion bird. Her carefully arranged composure was cracking like ice in a spring thaw, revealing beneath it a desperation that made her seem smaller, more fragile than the iron-willed matriarch who had ruled Cedar Ridge society for 2 decades. William Whitehorse had risen fully from his chair now, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and panic. At 25, he had never been forced to confront a challenge to his family's carefully constructed reputation, had never faced anyone with the moral authority to question the foundations upon which his privileged life had been built. His hand moved instinctively toward the pearl-handled revolver he wore as a symbol of his status, but something in Joseph Stonebear's steady gaze warned him that violence would only make his situation worse. "You have no right to be here, William," sputtered, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to maintain authority in a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his control. "This is a private ceremony for family members only, and you are neither family nor welcome." Joseph Stonebear's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle realignment that suggested a predator preparing to strike. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute moral certainty, the kind of authority that comes from speaking truth after years of enforced silence. "Family?" Joseph repeated, the word falling from his lips like a stone into deep water. "William Whitehorse, you speak of family as if you understand what the word means. But family is not just about blood that flows in comfortable channels, acknowledged by society and blessed by law. Sometimes family is about blood that flows in secret, hidden by shame and denied by cowardice. The crowd stirred uneasily at these words, sensing that they were about to witness something that would be talked about in Cedar Ridge for generations to come. Sheriff Patterson had moved closer, his hand still resting on his weapon, but his expression more troubled than threatening. The sheriff had served with Marcus Whitehorse during the Indian Wars, had seen the colonel's character tested in ways that few men ever experienced, and he was beginning to suspect that Joseph Stone Bear's presence here was about more than paying respects to a fallen comrade. Reverend Mills attempted to reassert control over the proceedings, stepping forward with the officious bearing of a man who believed that moral authority came from ordination rather than character. "Sir, I must insist that you respect the sanctity of this ceremony and withdraw immediately. If you have grievances or claims to make, they can be addressed through proper legal channels at a more appropriate time." Joseph's gaze shifted to the minister, and there was something in his dark eyes that made the reverend's words die in his throat. When Joseph spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried with such force that every person in the cemetery could hear every syllable. "Reverend Mills, you speak of sanctity and proper channels, but where was your concern for what was proper when a young woman was turned away from her own father's funeral? Where was your Christian charity when Sarah Whitehorse was told she had no right to mourn the man who gave her life?" The mention of Sarah's name sent another shockwave through the assembled mourners. Everyone in Cedar Ridge knew about Marcus Whitehorse's illegitimate daughter, but it was one of those open secrets that polite society agreed to ignore, like a family embarrassment that was acknowledged only in whispers and knowing glances. Margaret Whitehorse's composure finally cracked completely. "Stop!" she shrieked, her voice rising to a pitch that made several people in the crowd wince. "I will not allow you to stand there and destroy my husband's reputation with your lies and insinuations. Marcus was a good man, a Christian man, and I will not have his memory sullied by the ravings of a savage." The word savage hung in the air like a curse, its ugliness made even more stark by the desperation in Margaret's voice. But if she had hoped to wound Joseph or drive him away with racial slurs, she had badly miscalculated. Instead of recoiling, Joseph Stonebear straightened to his full height, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of generations of warriors who had never bowed to anyone. "Savage?" Joseph repeated, and there was something almost amused in his tone. "Margaret Dalton Whitehorse, you call me a savage while standing over the grave of a man whose greatest act of courage was loving a Comanche woman more than he feared your society's disapproval." The words hit the gathering like a physical blow. Gasps erupted from the crowd, and several women reached for their fans as if they might faint from the shock of what they were hearing. Men straightened in their chairs, leaning forward to catch every word of a revelation that would reshape everything they thought they knew. About one of Cedar Ridge's most prominent families, Margaret's face had gone beyond pale to a sickly gray color that made her look like she might collapse. She gripped the back of her chair for support, her knuckles white against the black wood as she struggled to maintain her balance in a world that was suddenly tilting beneath her feet. "That's impossible," she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction, only the desperate hope of someone trying to deny an inevitable truth. Joseph Stonebear reached into his vest and withdrew a small leather pouch, weathered by years of handling but carefully preserved. From it, he extracted a photograph, yellowed with age but still clear enough to make out the faces of the people it depicted. This photograph was taken in the summer of 1859, at a peace negotiation between the army and the Comanche, Joseph said, holding the image high enough for the crowd to see. "It shows Colonel Marcus Whitehorse, myself, and a young Comanche woman named Maria Moonhawk." He paused, letting the implications of the photograph sink in before continuing. "Maria Moonhawk was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, intelligent and spirited, with a laugh that could make the sun shine brighter and a courage that put most men to shame. She was also my intended bride, promised to me through arrangements made by our families when we were children. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word as Joseph revealed secrets that had been buried for nearly 3 decades. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, as if nature itself was holding its breath to hear this long overdue confession. But when Maria met Marcus Whitehorse during those peace negotiations, something happened that neither of them expected and neither could control. They fell in love, completely and irrevocably, with a passion that transcended the racial boundaries and social conventions that should have kept them apart. Joseph's voice grew softer, more reflective, as he remembered the pain of watching his intended bride fall in love with another man. I could have stopped it. I could have demanded my rights as Maria's promised husband, could have used tribal law to prevent their relationship from developing. But I had seen the look in her eyes when she watched Marcus, had heard the way her voice changed when she spoke his name, and I knew that true love is rarer than gold and more precious than life itself. William Whitehorse was staring at the photograph, with the horrified fascination of a man watching his entire world collapse. "Even if that's true," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "it doesn't prove anything about Sarah. It doesn't make her family." Joseph Stonebear's gaze shifted to William, and there was something almost pitying in his expression. "William, you speak of proof as if love leaves no traces, as if passion creates no consequences. But Maria Moonhawk did more than just love. Your father, in the winter of 1860, she bore him a daughter." The words fell like hammer blows on the assembled crowd. Women gasped and reached for their smelling salts, while men shifted uncomfortably in their chairs as they tried to process the implications of what they were hearing. The carefully ordered world of Cedar Ridge society was crumbling before their eyes, revealed to be built on foundations of lies and willful blindness. The child was born in a cabin your father purchased under an assumed name, far from both the white settlements and the Comanche camps that would have rejected her, Joseph continued, his voice growing stronger as he finally gave voice to the truth he had carried for so long. "I was there when she took her first breath, was the first to hold her when her mother was too weak from childbirth to lift her. And I have watched her grow into a woman of remarkable strength and character, despite the obstacles placed in her path by a society that refused to acknowledge her existence." Margaret Whitehorse suddenly lunged forward, her careful dignity completely abandoned as desperation drove her to attack the man who was destroying everything she had worked to build. "Lies!" she screamed, reaching for the photograph in Joseph's hands. "All lies! I won't let you destroy my family with your fabrications." But Joseph easily stepped back, keeping the photograph out of her reach while maintaining the calm demeanor that had carried him through decades of frontier conflicts. "Margaret, the truth needs no defense from me. It stands on its own merits, supported by evidence that cannot be denied." He reached into his vest again and withdrew a second item, a folded document, official-looking, and bearing the seal of the territorial government. "This is the deed to the cabin where Sarah was born, purchased by Marcus Whitehorse in February of 1860, and held in trust for his ward Sarah Hernandez, as she was known after being placed with a Mexican family for her own protection." The document passed through the crowd like a hot coal, each person who touched it recoiling as if burned by the evidence it contained. The legal language was clear and unambiguous. Marcus Whitehorse had indeed purchased property specifically to provide for a child born outside his marriage, and he had continued to support that child financially throughout her life. Sheriff Patterson stepped forward, his weathered face grave as he examined the deed. As a former military man and longtime law enforcement officer, he had seen enough legal documents to recognize authentic paperwork when he saw it. The deed was genuine, properly executed, and filed with the Territorial Registry, providing legal proof of Marcus Whitehorse's financial responsibility for Sarah's welfare. "This document is authentic," Patterson announced, his voice carrying the authority of his office. Colonel Whitehorse did indeed maintain financial responsibility for Sarah Hernandez, who we now know as Sarah Whitehorse from her birth until his death. The confirmation from the sheriff sent another wave of shock through the assembled mourners. This was no longer just the word of an Indian warrior against the protests of a grieving widow. This was documented legal evidence, the kind of proof that would stand up in any court of law. But Joseph Stone Bear was not finished with his revelations. He reached into his pouch one final time and withdrew a small silver locket, tarnished with age but still beautiful. This locket belonged to Maria Moonhawk, he said, opening it to reveal a miniature portrait of a stunningly beautiful young woman with dark hair and eyes that seemed to sparkle with life and intelligence. Before she died giving birth to your father's child, Maria made me promise that her daughter would never forget her heritage, would never be ashamed of the blood that flowed in her veins. She made me swear that someday, Sarah would know the truth about her parents' love and the courage it took for them to create life in the face of a world that refused to accept their union. Joseph's voice broke slightly as he remembered Maria's final moments, the way she had pressed the locket into his hands with her dying breath, and begged him to ensure that her daughter understood she came from warriors and lovers, from people who had never surrendered their dignity or their right to exist. I have carried this burden for 28 years, Joseph continued, his voice growing stronger as he neared the end of his long overdue confession. I have watched Sarah grow up alone and isolated, denied the family connections that every child deserves, because I was too much of a coward to speak the truth that might have given her the acceptance she needed. He turned to face the entire gathering, his dark eyes blazing with the fire of absolute moral conviction. But I will be a coward no longer. Today, in front of this entire community, I declare that Sarah Whitehorse has more right to mourn her father than anyone else here. She is the daughter of true love, born from a union that transcended race and convention, and she carries within her the best qualities of both her parents. The cemetery had fallen into complete silence, except for the sound of the wind rustling through the mesquite trees where Sarah herself stood hidden, tears streaming down her face as she listened to the truth about her origins being revealed at last. Everything she had wondered about, every question that had haunted her lonely childhood, was finally being answered in the most public and dramatic way possible. Joseph Stone Bear closed the locket and held it high for everyone to see. This is Sarah's inheritance from her mother, just as her father's love and his sense of justice are her inheritance from him. And if anyone in this community has a problem with her heritage, with her right to exist and be acknowledged as Marcus Whitehorse's daughter, then they will have to answer to me. The challenge hung in the air like thunder, and for the first time in the entire confrontation, no one seemed willing to respond. The truth had been spoken, the evidence had been presented, and the moral authority was clearly on Joseph Stone Bear's side. Margaret Whitehorse stood defeated beside her husband's coffin, her elaborate funeral plans destroyed by revelations she had spent 20 years trying to prevent. But the most important person in the entire drama had yet to make her appearance. And Joseph Stone Bear knew that the time had finally come to call Sarah Whitehorse out of the shadows and into the light where she belonged. The moment Joseph Stone Bear finished speaking, he turned his back on the stunned crowd and walked deliberately toward the cluster of mesquite trees at the edge of Boot Hill Cemetery. His moccasined feet made no sound on the dry grass, but his movement created a ripple of confusion among the mourners who had been hanging on his every word. Where was he going? Was the confrontation over? Had he said everything he had come to say? Sarah Whitehorse pressed herself deeper into the shadows of the trees, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the Comanche warrior approach her hiding place. She had listened to every word of his revelations, had felt her entire understanding of her own life shift and reshape with each new piece of evidence he presented. The photograph of her mother, the legal deed, the silver locket, these were the missing pieces of a puzzle she had been trying to solve her entire life. But now, As Joseph drew closer to her concealment, Sarah felt a terror unlike anything she had ever experienced. For 28 years, she had lived in the shadows, existing on the margins of Cedar Ridge society, invisible to those who mattered and ignored by those who might have acknowledged her. The prospect of stepping into the bright, harsh light of public scrutiny was more frightening than any physical danger she had ever faced. "Sarah," Joseph said quietly when he reached the edge of the trees, his voice gentle but firm. "It's time." She shook her head, backing deeper into the shadows. "I can't. You don't understand what you've done. These people will never accept me. You've just made everything worse." Joseph stopped just outside the trees, close enough that they could speak in low voices but far enough away that he wasn't violating her need for space and time to process what she had heard. Behind him, the crowd of mourners was beginning to stir and whisper, their shock giving way to curiosity about where the Indian warrior had gone and what he intended to do next. "Sarah, your mother made me promise that you would never be ashamed of your heritage, that you would understand you come from warriors and lovers, from people who never surrendered their dignity," Joseph said, his voice carrying the weight of a 28-year-old vow. "But I failed her, and I failed you by allowing fear to keep me silent for so long." Sarah clutched the silver pendant her father had left her, feeling its weight against her chest like an anchor in a storm. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I've built a life here, small as it is. I have my cabin, my work, people who tolerate me if they don't accept me. If I walk out there now, if I claim my place as his daughter, I'll lose even that little bit of security." Joseph's expression softened with understanding. He had spent his own life walking between two worlds, never fully accepted by either, and he knew the terrible vulnerability that came with existing in the spaces between defined categories. But he also knew something that Sarah had yet to learn. That sometimes the greatest courage comes not from fighting external enemies, but from accepting the truth about yourself. "Your mother was 18 when she fell in love with your father," Joseph said, settling into a crouch that would allow him to wait as long as necessary for Sarah to find her courage. "She was promised to me, expected to marry within the tribe, and live the life that had been planned for her since childhood. But when she met Marcus Whitehorse, she chose love over security, chose truth over convenience." He paused, letting Sarah absorb the parallel between her mother's situation and her own. "Maria could have kept her relationship with your father secret, could have married me as expected and lived a comfortable, accepted life within Comanche society. Instead, she chose to follow her heart, even knowing it would cost her everything she had ever known." Sarah felt tears burning her eyes as she imagined her mother facing the same kind of impossible choice that now confronted her. But she died because of that choice. She lost everything. "No," Joseph said firmly. "She gained everything that mattered. She loved completely and was loved in return. She created life from that love. She lived with truth instead of lies, with authenticity instead of pretense. And even though her time was short, it was fully lived." Behind them, the voices from the funeral were growing louder and more agitated. Margaret Whitehorse was demanding that Sheriff Patterson arrest Joseph for disturbing the peace, while William was insisting that his father's funeral be allowed to continue without further interruption. But other voices were beginning to join the conversation, people asking questions that had been whispered in private for years, but never spoken aloud. "Where is she?" Sarah heard someone call out. "If Sarah Whitehorse is really the colonel's daughter, why isn't she here?" "Maybe she doesn't want to show her face," came another voice. "Maybe she knows she doesn't belong." Joseph heard these comments, too, and his jaw tightened with anger at the casual cruelty they represented. But when he spoke to Sarah, his voice remained gentle and encouraging. "Those people out there have spent 28 years pretending you don't exist, because acknowledging you would force them to confront uncomfortable truths about their precious social order," he said. "They've been comfortable with their lies, because you've allowed them to be comfortable. But comfort built on lies is just another form of cowardice. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on her. In her mind, she could see her mother as Joseph had described her, young, beautiful, brave enough to choose love over convention. She could see her father, torn between his public duties and his private desires, trying to do right by everyone, and succeeding only in creating pain for all involved. "What if I'm not brave enough?" she whispered. "What if I'm not strong enough to be what they need me to be?" Joseph smiled, and for the first time since arriving at the cemetery, his expression held genuine warmth instead of grim determination. "Sarah, you've been brave every day of your life. You've survived isolation, rejection, and poverty. You've built a life for yourself with no help from anyone. You've maintained your dignity in the face of constant humiliation. If that isn't courage, I don't know what is." He stood up slowly, extending his hand toward her. "But now it's time for a different kind of courage. It's time to stop hiding and start claiming your place in the world. Not because you need their acceptance, but because your mother's sacrifice and your father's love deserve to be acknowledged." Sarah looked at his outstretched hand, seeing in it an invitation to step out of the shadows that had defined her entire existence. Everything in her life had led to this moment: the secret visits from her father, the mysterious appearance of Joseph over the years, the gradual accumulation of questions that had never been answered. Now the answers were being offered to her, but only if she had the courage to claim them publicly. She thought about the letter her father had left her, with its acknowledgement of his failures and his hope that she would find the strength he had never possessed. She thought about the silver pendant around her neck, a tangible connection to the father who had loved her, but never found the courage to claim her. Most of all, she thought about the mother she had never known, who had died bringing her into the world but had left behind a legacy of choosing truth over comfort. Taking a deep breath that seemed to come from the very center of her being, Sarah reached out and grasped Joseph's hand. The moment their fingers touched, she felt something shift inside her, a settling into place of pieces that had been floating disconnected for 28 years. This was her heritage, not just the blood that flowed in her veins, but the courage that had brought her into existence against all odds and social conventions. Together, they walked out of the shadows of the mesquite trees and into the harsh afternoon sunlight that illuminated Boot Hill Cemetery. The effect on the crowd was immediate and electric. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as every eye turned toward the woman, who had been the subject of whispered speculation for decades, but had rarely been seen in public settings. Sarah walked with her head held high, her simple navy dress and braided hair a stark contrast to the elaborate mourning costumes worn by the other women present. But there was something in her bearing, a dignity that seemed to come from within rather than from external trappings, that commanded attention and respect even from those who had spent years dismissing her existence. She could feel the weight of their stares, could hear the sharp intake of breath as people got their first clear look at the woman who had been both Marcus Whitehorse's greatest secret and his greatest shame. Some of the faces in the crowd showed curiosity, others displayed hostility, and a few reflected something that might have been recognition or even sympathy. Margaret Whitehorse stood frozen beside her husband's coffin, her face cycling through expressions of rage, fear, and disbelief as she watched the woman she had spent 20 years trying to erase walk calmly toward the center of the funeral ceremony. William looked like he might be physically sick, his face pale and his hands shaking as he realized that his comfortable assumption of inheritance was about to become considerably more complicated. Sheriff Patterson stepped forward as Sarah and Joseph approached the gathered mourners, his hand still resting on his weapon, but his expression more curious than threatening. The sheriff had known about Sarah's existence for years, had even felt a grudging respect for the way she had conducted herself, despite the impossible circumstances of her position in Cedar Ridge society. "Miss Sarah," Patterson said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect that sent another ripple of shock through the crowd. "I'm sorry for your loss." The simple words of condolence, offered publicly and without qualification, represented a seismic shift in Sarah's social standing. If Sheriff Patterson was acknowledging her right to mourn Marcus Whitehorse, then her position as the colonel's daughter was no longer a matter of speculation or gossip. It was established fact, acknowledged by the highest law enforcement authority in Cedar Ridge. "Thank you, Sheriff," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment she was living through. "I appreciate your kindness." She turned to face the crowd of mourners, many of whom she recognized from years of existing on the periphery of their lives. These were the people who had purchased goods from stores where she worked, who had passed her on the street without acknowledgement, who had spoken about her in whispers while pretending she didn't exist. "My name is Sarah Whitehorse," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the cemetery despite its quiet tone. "I am the daughter of Colonel Marcus Whitehorse and Maria Moonhawk, and I have come to say goodbye to my father." The formal introduction sent another wave of shock through the assembled mourners. This was not the apologetic, shame-faced acknowledgement they might have expected from someone in her position. This was a declaration of identity and rights, delivered with the kind of quiet authority that brooked no argument or contradiction. "Margaret." Whitehorse finally found her voice, though it came out as a strangled cry rather than the commanding tone she usually employed. "This is intolerable. I will not allow this farce to continue. Sheriff Patterson, I demand that you remove these people from my husband's funeral immediately." But Sheriff Patterson made no move to comply with Margaret's demand. Instead, he looked thoughtfully at Sarah, taking in her dignified bearing and the obvious sincerity of her grief. "Ma'am," he said to Margaret, "if this young woman is indeed Colonel Whitehorse's daughter, then she has every right to attend his funeral. The law doesn't recognize distinctions between legitimate and illegitimate children when it comes to mourning the dead." The sheriff's statement was delivered with the authority of someone who understood both law and justice, and it effectively ended any legal basis for excluding Sarah from the ceremony. Margaret's face went from pale to ashen as she realized that her carefully constructed social barriers were crumbling in the face of moral and legal authority. Reverend Mills, who had been silent since Joseph's revelations began, stepped forward. With the uncertain air of a man trying to regain control of a situation that had spun far beyond his ability to manage. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we might continue with the funeral service and address these family matters at a more appropriate time." But Sarah shook her head, her voice gentle but firm as she addressed the minister who had presided over her father's life for so many years without ever acknowledging her existence. "Reverend Mills, with respect, there will never be a more appropriate time than now. My father is dead, and I may never have another opportunity to speak publicly about what he meant to me." She moved closer to the coffin, ignoring Margaret's sharp intake of breath and William's muttered protests. Standing beside the polished mahogany casket that held her father's remains, Sarah felt a deep sense of completion, as if a circle that had been broken for 28 years was finally being closed. "Marcus Whitehorse was not a perfect man," Sarah said, her voice carrying to every corner of the cemetery. "He made choices that caused pain to people he loved, and he lived with regrets that haunted him until his dying day. But he was also a man capable of great love, even when that love came at enormous personal cost." She reached into her dress and withdrew the silver pendant her father had left her, holding it high enough for everyone to see. "He gave me this before he died, along with a letter that acknowledged me as his daughter and asked for my forgiveness for not having the courage to claim me publicly while he lived." The sight of the pendant, gleaming in the afternoon sunlight, provided physical evidence of Marcus Whitehorse's relationship with his illegitimate daughter that no amount of denial could erase. Several people in the crowd leaned forward to get a better look, their curiosity overcoming their social conditioning. "I don't ask for your acceptance or your approval," Sarah continued, addressing the entire gathering with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through 28 years of isolation. "I don't need your permission to mourn my father or to claim my place as his daughter. But I do ask for your honesty, with yourselves and with your children, about the true cost of the prejudices that have shaped this community for too long." She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering what would prove to be the most powerful statement of the entire confrontation. "My father loved a Comanche woman, and that love created me. If you think that makes me less worthy of respect, then you reveal more about your own limitations than about mine." The silence that followed Sarah's declaration stretched across Boot Hill Cemetery like the calm before a thunderstorm, heavy with the weight of 28 years of buried truth, finally brought to light. Every face in the crowd reflected the struggle to process what they had witnessed, not just the revelation of Sarah's parentage, but the collapse of the carefully constructed social order that had governed Cedar Ridge for decades. In that moment of suspended reality, something fundamental shifted in the community's collective consciousness. The woman standing beside Marcus Whitehorse's coffin was no longer an embarrassing secret to be ignored or whispered about in private. She had claimed her identity with such dignity and moral authority that denial was no longer possible. Sarah Whitehorse existed, she mattered, and she would not be erased. The first person to break the silence was unexpected. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, an elderly widow who had been one of Cedar Ridge's most prominent socialites for the better part of 40 years. Mrs. Hartwell had known Marcus Whitehorse since his arrival in Texas, had watched him build his ranch and his reputation, and had always sensed that there were depths to the man that he kept carefully hidden from public view. "Colonel Whitehorse," Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice carrying clearly across the cemetery as she addressed the coffin directly, "you were a man of secrets, but you were not a man without honor. Your daughter does you credit." The words hit the gathering like a benediction, coming as they did from someone whose social standing was unquestioned, and whose opinions carried significant weight in Cedar Ridge society. If Eleanor Hartwell was willing to publicly acknowledge Sarah's legitimacy as Marcus Whitehorse's daughter, then the battle for social acceptance had taken a decisive turn. Other voices began to join in, tentatively at first but with growing confidence, as people found the courage to speak truths they had known but never dared articulate. Tom Brennan, the Irish livery stable owner who had delivered Marcus's final letter to Sarah, stepped forward from the back of the crowd. "Miss Sarah," he said, removing his hat and holding it respectfully to his chest, "your father spoke of you often in his final years. He was proud of the woman you'd become, proud of your strength and your character. He wanted you to know that, even if he couldn't say it while he lived." Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes at Tom's words, the first genuine expression of her father's feelings that she had ever heard from someone outside the family. For so many years, she had wondered if Marcus Whitehorse felt anything for her beyond duty and obligation. To learn that he had spoken of her with pride was a gift beyond measure. Dr. Samuel Morrison, Cedar Ridge's only physician, cleared his throat and stepped forward. Morrison was a man of science and reason, someone who had always been more concerned with evidence than with social convention. "I attended your birth, Miss Sarah," he said quietly. "Your father was there that night, pacing the cabin floor like an expectant father should. When you took your first breath, I saw more joy in his eyes than I had ever seen before or since." The doctor's revelation sent another ripple through the crowd. If Dr. Morrison had attended Sarah's birth and witnessed Marcus Whitehorse's paternal joy, then the love between Marcus and Maria Moonhawk had been more than just a brief affair. It had been a genuine relationship that had created not just a child, but a family. But not everyone in the gathering was prepared to accept the new reality that was being created before their eyes. A harsh voice cut through the growing atmosphere of acceptance, sharp with indignation and bitter with years of carefully maintained prejudice. "This is all very touching," came the voice of Judge Nathaniel Crawford, a man whose political career had been built on maintaining the racial and social hierarchies that kept people like Sarah in their place. But sentiment doesn't change law. Illegitimate children have no legal standing, no inheritance rights, and no claim to their father's name or property. Judge Crawford was a thin, angular man in his 60s whose pale eyes held the cold certainty of someone who had never questioned his own moral authority. He had served as Cedar Ridge's municipal judge for 15 years, dispensing what he considered justice while carefully protecting the interests of the community's most powerful families. Sarah turned to face the judge, and there was something in her expression that made him take an involuntary step backward. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent her entire life learning to survive in a hostile world. "Judge Crawford," she said, "you speak of law as if it were the same thing as justice. But I have read enough to know that the law is not always right, and justice is not always legal. My father acknowledged me as his daughter in his final letter, and that acknowledgement carries more moral weight than any legal document you might cite." Joseph Stone Bear, who had remained silent during the exchange, stepped forward to stand beside Sarah. His presence seemed to amplify her words, lending them the weight of his own moral authority and his decades of experience navigating the complex relationship between law and justice on the frontier. "Judge Crawford," Joseph said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who had learned to choose his words carefully, "you speak of legal standing as if it determines human worth. But Sarah Whitehorse's value as a person, her right to respect and acknowledgement, doesn't depend on documents filed in courthouse records. It depends on her character, her actions, and the love that brought her into this world." The judge's face flushed with anger at being challenged so directly, particularly by a Native American in front of the town's most prominent citizens. "You have no standing to speak here," Crawford snapped. "This is a matter for civilized people to resolve according to proper legal procedures." The word civilized hung in the air like a slap, its racist implications clear to everyone present. But if Judge Crawford had hoped to put Joseph in his place with racial slurs, he had badly miscalculated. Instead of backing down, Joseph straightened to his full height, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the accumulated authority of generations of leaders who had never bowed to anyone. "Civilized?" Joseph repeated, and there was something almost amused in his tone. "Judge Crawford, I have seen your civilization's idea of justice. I have watched it break treaties, steal land, and murder children. If acknowledging a daughter's right to mourn her father is uncivilized, then I wear that label proudly." The exchange between Joseph and Judge Crawford had crystallized the fundamental conflict that lay at the heart of the day's revelations. This was not just about Sarah's legitimacy as Marcus Whitehorse's daughter. It was about the kind of community Cedar Ridge wanted to be, one that clung to old prejudices and exclusions, or one that was willing to embrace a more inclusive and honest vision of itself. Sheriff Patterson, who had been watching the confrontation with growing unease, stepped forward to restore order before the situation could escalate into something more dangerous. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his badge and his years of experience, "this is a funeral, not a courtroom. Whatever legal questions may arise from today's revelations can be addressed through proper channels at a more appropriate time." But Sarah shook her head, her voice gentle but firm, as she addressed the sheriff who had shown her more respect in one day than most of Cedar Ridge's citizens had offered in 28 years. "Sheriff Patterson, with respect, there may never be a more appropriate time than now. My father is dead, and the truth about our relationship has finally been spoken aloud. If I don't claim my place in his life today, I may never have another opportunity." She turned to address the entire gathering, her voice growing stronger as she drew upon reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "I don't need Judge Crawford's legal approval or anyone else's permission to call myself Marcus Whitehorse's Daughter. I am his daughter, by blood and by love, and nothing can change that reality. Margaret Whitehorse, who had been silent since her earlier outburst, suddenly stepped forward with the desperate energy of someone making a final stand against forces beyond her control. Her carefully arranged hair was disheveled, her expensive dress was wrinkled, and her makeup was streaked with tears of rage and frustration. Even if everything you claim is true, Margaret said, her voice rising to a pitch that made several people wince, it doesn't matter. Marcus is dead, his will has been properly executed, and his estate will be distributed according to his legal instructions. You may call yourself his daughter, but you have no claim to his property or his name. Sarah looked at Margaret with something approaching pity, seeing in the older woman's desperation a fear that went beyond concerns about money or property. Margaret had built her entire identity around being Marcus Whitehorse's wife, the respectable woman who had given him legitimacy and social standing. The existence of Sarah and the revelation of Marcus's love for Maria Moonhawk threatened to destroy everything Margaret thought she knew about her own life. Mrs. Whitehorse, Sarah said quietly, I have never wanted your husband's money or his property. I have supported myself through my own work for years, and I will continue to do so. All I have ever wanted was acknowledgement, the simple recognition that I existed and that I mattered to the man who gave me life. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. You have had 28 years as his acknowledged wife, 28 years of social standing and respect and security. I have had secret visits in the darkness and whispered conversations that could never be shared with anyone. If you think I have somehow gotten the better part of that bargain, then you understand nothing about what it means to be alone in the world. The words were delivered without malice or bitterness, but they carried a weight of truth that seemed to drain the fight out of Margaret Whitehorse. For the first time since the confrontation began, she seemed to see Sarah not as a threat to be eliminated, but as a person who had suffered genuine loss and isolation. William Whitehorse, however, was not prepared to surrender his position so easily. At 25, he had lived his entire life as the undisputed heir to his father's fortune and influence, and the prospect of sharing that inheritance with an illegitimate half-sister was unthinkable. This is ridiculous, William said, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to maintain authority in a situation that had spun completely beyond his control. Even if she is my father's daughter, she has no legal standing. The law is clear on this matter. But Dr. Morrison stepped forward, again, holding a document that he had retrieved from his medical bag. Actually, William, the law may not be as clear as you think. I have here a copy of your father's last will and testament, which he updated just 6 months ago. The doctor's announcement sent a shockwave through the gathering. Everyone had assumed that Marcus Whitehorse's will was a straightforward document that left everything to his wife and legitimate son. The possibility that he had made recent changes opened up entirely new questions about his intentions and his feelings toward his illegitimate daughter. Dr. Morrison opened the document and began to read in his precise, clinical voice. I, Marcus Whitehorse, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my last will and testament. To my wife Margaret, I leave the house in town and sufficient funds to maintain her in comfort for the remainder of her life. To my son William, I leave the ranch and the majority of my business interests, with the expectation that he will continue to build upon what I have established. William's face showed visible relief at these words, but Dr. Morrison was not finished reading. However, the doctor continued, I also acknowledge that I have a daughter, Sarah, born of my union with Maria Moonhawk in the year 1860. To Sarah, I leave the sum of $10,000, the cabin where she was born, and the 100 acres surrounding it. More importantly, I leave her my acknowledgement and my love, along with my deepest regrets for not having had the courage to claim her publicly while I lived. The reading of this provision from Marcus Whitehorse's will create a sensation in the cemetery. $10,000 was a substantial sum, enough to provide Sarah with genuine financial security for the first time in her life. But more important than the money was the formal acknowledgement, the legal recognition of her status as Marcus Whitehorse's daughter. Judge Crawford's face had gone pale as he realized that his earlier pronouncements about Sarah's lack of legal standing had been premature and incorrect. If Marcus Whitehorse had formally acknowledged her in his will, then she did indeed have legal rights that would be recognized by any court in the territory. Sarah stood motionless beside her father's coffin, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had just learned. For 28 years, she had believed herself to be alone in the world, dependent on her own efforts for survival and acknowledgement. Now, in the space of a single afternoon, she had learned the truth about her mother's love, her father's regrets, and her own place in the complex web of relationships that defined Cedar Ridge society. Joseph Stonebear placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, offering the silent support of someone who understood the overwhelming nature of such revelations. "Your father kept his final promise," he said quietly. "He found the courage in death that he couldn't find in life." Sarah looked up at Joseph, tears streaming down her face, but her expression showing something that might have been peace. "My mother would be proud," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She chose love over security, and in the end, that love was acknowledged. The funeral ceremony that had begun as a carefully scripted celebration of Marcus Whitehorse's public life had transformed into something far more powerful and meaningful, a reckoning with truth, a confrontation with prejudice, and ultimately, a moment of healing for wounds that had festered in darkness for too long. As the sun began to set over Boot Hill Cemetery, casting long shadows across the weathered headstones and monuments, the people of Cedar Ridge found themselves forever changed by what they had witnessed. Sarah Whitehorse was no longer a shameful secret to be ignored or whispered about. She was Marcus Whitehorse's acknowledged daughter, a woman of substance and inheritance, someone who would have to be reckoned with in the community's future. But more than her legal standing had changed. In claiming her identity with such dignity and courage, Sarah had challenged the very foundations of the prejudice and exclusion that had defined Cedar Ridge society. She had shown that love could transcend racial barriers, that truth was more powerful than lies, and that courage could emerge from the most unlikely places. The funeral of Colonel Marcus Whitehorse was finally allowed to conclude. But it was not the man in the coffin who was truly laid to rest that day. It was the comfortable lies and willful blindness that had allowed an entire community to ignore the consequences of their prejudices. In their place, something new and more honest had been born, a recognition that families come in many forms, that love knows no boundaries, and that sometimes the greatest courage comes from simply refusing to remain invisible. As the mourners began to disperse, many of them approached Sarah to offer condolences and acknowledgement that had been decades in the making. Others, like Judge Crawford and a few of the more rigid members of Cedar Ridge society, departed in uncomfortable silence, their worldview shattered but their capacity for change uncertain. Sarah Whitehorse stood beside her father's grave as the last of the mourners departed, finally free to mourn in the open air and bright sunlight. She was no longer alone, no longer invisible, no longer ashamed. She was exactly what Joseph Stonebear had promised she would be, a woman who had inherited the courage of warriors and the dignity of those who refused to be broken by the prejudices of others. The reckoning was complete, and Cedar Ridge would never be the same.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.